The West never ran out of bad men. What it ran out of was men willing to stop them. The summer of 1882 burned hot across New Mexico territory, and out near Galisteo Basin, a young widow was about to find out how little the law mattered once rich men decided they wanted your land. That law often belonged to whoever had the most silver. Clara Whitcomb was only 25. Her husband had been dead less than 4 months. Thomas Whitcomb died inside the silver mines near Cerrillos, crushed beneath falling timber, according to the official story. Most folks around Santa Fe accepted that explanation because life moved fast in mining country. A man died, another man took his place underground. The mine kept running, but Clara never believed her husband died by accident. Thomas had spent the last weeks of his life drinking less whiskey, speaking in whispers, and hiding papers beneath loose boards inside their house. He kept saying one name over and over. Silas Vane. People in Santa Fe spoke that name carefully. Silas owned silver claims outside Cerrillo. He controlled freight wagons moving toward the railroad. Deputies drank with him. Store owners borrowed money from him. Even decent men lowered their voices when he walked nearby. And now Silas wanted Clara's land, not because the house was worth much, not because the dry fields were beautiful, but because water ran beneath that property, and an old tunnel from the mine crossed somewhere under the hills near her land. Thomas found out before he died. That was the mistake that buried him. And 3 nights later, somebody kicked open Clara Whitcomb's front door after sundown. 3 days before everything went to hell, Caleb Rusk rode into Santa Fe beneath a brutal afternoon sun. He looked like the kind of man folks stopped asking questions about years ago. 44 years old, dusty poncho, sunburned neck, gray beginning to creep into his beard, a Colt single-action army hanging low on his hip, not polished, not flashy, just worn enough to tell the truth. Caleb did not ride into town searching for justice. He came looking for quiet work and a place to sleep without hearing gunfire outside his window. People around the plaza barely noticed him at first, just another aging drifter crossing through New Mexico territory. But old lawmen and bartenders paid attention to the way he watched doors before entering buildings. They noticed how his hand stayed close to his coffee cup, never his whiskey. And they noticed his eyes. Caleb first heard Clara Whitcomb's name inside Miguel Arroyo's blacksmith shop. Miguel spoke softly while hammering glowing steel. He said Silas Vane had been pressuring the widow for weeks. Men kept riding past her house after dark. Deputy Orrin Pike visited too often, and yesterday someone shot her lantern off the porch from 50 yards away. Miguel expected Caleb to ignore the story like everybody else. Most men did. Because helping a widow against Silas Vane was the kind of decision that shortened a man's life. Caleb almost walked away. Truth was, he had spent years avoiding trouble exactly like this, years avoiding towns where rich men bought sheriffs, years avoiding causes that sounded noble until bodies started dropping in the dirt. But something about Clara's story stayed with him. Maybe because he once failed to stop something ugly long ago in Kansas. Maybe because old regrets grow heavier during lonely summers. Or maybe because deep down, Caleb Rusk still hated cowardice more than danger. The next morning, Caleb still tried talking himself out of getting involved, but sometime after sunrise, he finally rode out toward Galisteo Basin just to see the place for himself. The house stood alone beneath the dying sunlight. No smoke from the chimney, no horse tied outside, no sound except dry wind brushing through dead grass. Caleb stepped down from his horse slowly, and then he heard it. A muffled cry from inside the house, a chair scraping hard across wooden floorboards, and a man's voice laughing quietly. Caleb moved toward the door. His hand dropped near the Colt on his hip. Because men like Caleb learned one hard truth a long time ago. Sometimes evil did not hide in dark alleys or outlaw camps. Sometimes it walked straight through the front door wearing a clean vest and an expensive smile. And before that night ended, Caleb Rusk would have to decide something that haunted him for years. Was he still the kind of man willing to stop it, or was he just another tired coward with a gun? Caleb stopped just outside the door. The crying inside the house suddenly went quiet. That was the part he hated most, not the shouting, not the threats. The silence after fear settled into a room. He pushed the door open slowly. The smell hit him first. Dust, sweat, lamp oil, and trouble. Deputy Orrin Pike stood near the table with a double-barrel shotgun hanging loose in his hands. Big man, wide shoulders, the kind of face that looked mean even when smiling. Across the room, Clara Whitcomb was down on one knee beside a broken chair, breathing hard, one hand pressed against her cheek. Silas Vane stood over her holding a folded paper. His expensive black vest looked strange inside that little farmhouse, like a banker wandering into a wolf den by mistake. Nobody spoke for a second. The only sound came from a loose screen door creaking softly in the summer heat. Then Silas smiled, not nervous, not surprised, just annoyed. Like Caleb had interrupted supper. "You picked a poor time to visit," Silas said. Caleb kept one hand near his Colt. His eyes stayed on Clara. She looked scared, but not broken. Truth was, Caleb could still see fear trembling in her hands. She was simply too stubborn to let men like Silas see it. That mattered to him more than he expected. Pike lifted the shotgun slightly. "Best walk away, old man." Caleb gave a tired little shrug. He had heard tougher lines than that from drunks too blind to stand straight. Then Clara spoke quietly. "He's trying to force me to sign the land over." Silas let out a soft laugh. "That land's worthless without a man to work it." Caleb finally looked at him. "Funny thing about evil men, most of them never think they're evil. They think they're practical." Silas talked like a businessman settling accounts. Like threatening a widow inside her own house was no different than buying cattle. Caleb had met men like that all his life, and they always left bodies behind them. Outside, wind brushed against the dry grass. Inside, nobody moved. Then Caleb noticed something near Clara's foot, a loose floorboard, and beside it, scrape marks in the wood. Somebody had hidden something there recently. Silas noticed Caleb looking. That tiny smile disappeared fast. Now things made sense. This wasn't really about land. It was about whatever Thomas Whitcomb left behind before he died in that mine. Silas took one slow step closer to Clara. "Last chance," he said quietly. Clara stared at the floor, breathing hard. Then she lifted her head and said something Caleb probably would have remembered for the rest of his life. "My husband died scared." Her voice shook a little. "But he didn't die lying." That landed harder than any punch. Even Pike looked uncomfortable for half a second. Silas grabbed Clara by the arm. And that was enough. Caleb's voice came low and sharp. "Stop, you sick bastard." Everything moved at once after that. Pike swung the shotgun upward. Caleb kicked the chair across the floor. The chair slammed into Pike's knee hard enough to throw his aim wide. The shotgun blasted into the ceiling. Dust and splinters rained down through the hot room. Claire dropped beside the table. Silas cursed and stumbled backward. Caleb drew his Colt fast. Not flashy, not theatrical, just fast enough to make surviving possible. Pike rushed him anyway. Big mistake. Men built like Pike often trusted strength too much. Caleb smashed the Colt across Pike's jaw and drove him into the wall. But not before Pike slammed the shotgun stock hard into Caleb's ribs. Pain shot through his side sharp enough to nearly drop him. The whole house shook. Outside, horses panicked at the noise. Then somebody fired through the window from outside. Glass exploded across the room. Silas had brought more men. Of course he had. Caleb grabbed Clara and pulled her behind the overturned table. She looked up at him, breathing hard, and for the first time, Caleb saw it clearly in her eyes. Not panic, not weakness, just exhaustion. The kind that comes from fighting too long without help. Then Silas shouted from the doorway while backing outside. "I knew I recognized you the second you rode into Santa Fe," Silas said. Marshall Doyle up in Kansas used to talk about Caleb Rusk like he was some kind of ghost. "You still don't know what you're protecting." "Rusk," Caleb froze. He had not heard that name spoken by someone from his past in years. Silas pointed toward the loose floorboard. "Thomas left behind something that'll bury more men than him." Then Silas climbed onto his horse and disappeared into the dying sunlight. The remaining riders followed close behind him. For a few seconds, the only sound left was Pike groaning on the floor and loose boards creaking in the summer heat. Caleb looked down at Clara, and deep inside, a bad feeling started growing. Because men like Silas Vane did not risk this much over worthless land, not unless something hidden beneath that house could destroy them all.
Now, before we go further, go on and subscribe if you're enjoying the story so far. Then pour yourself some coffee or maybe a little evening tea.
And tell me this, what time is it where you're listening from tonight? And what part of the country are you sitting in right now? Caleb waited nearly a full minute before speaking again. Years ago, he would have started asking hard questions right away. Back when he still wore a badge, he believed every problem could be solved fast if a man pushed hard enough. Life cured him of that foolishness. Now he understood something most older men learn eventually. Scared people talked better when silence came first. Clara stayed seated beside the broken table while dust drifted slowly through the room. Her hands still shook a little, not from weakness, just from too many bad nights without sleep. Pike groaned somewhere near the wall. Miguel finally came rushing through the back door, carrying an old revolver that looked older than he was. The moment he saw Clara alive, his shoulders dropped with relief. "Thought we'd lost you," he muttered. Clara gave him a tired little nod, then she looked toward Caleb. "He knows your name?" Caleb did not answer right away. That silence told Clara enough. Men running from their past usually hated hearing it catch up. Miguel dragged Pike into a chair and tied his wrists tight with horse rope. Pike spat blood onto the floorboards and grinned anyway. That kind of grin always meant trouble was still coming. Caleb ignored him and crouched beside the loose floorboard near Clara's feet. He pulled it up carefully. Underneath sat a small leather notebook wrapped in cloth. Thomas Whitcomb's handwriting covered every page. Dates, freight numbers, names, silver shipments leaving Cirillo's late at night without tax records. And one name appeared over and over again. Silas Vane. Caleb had seen greedy men before, but nobody hunted a widow this hard over simple land. That notebook scared Silas Vane more than a loaded gun. Miguel let out a low whistle. "Sweet Lord." Clara wiped her face and leaned closer. Thomas found a tunnel beneath the old mine. She spoke quietly now, steadier than before. He said Silas was moving silver through it after dark and hiding the real amount from territorial agents. Caleb kept turning pages. One entry stopped him cold. June 11th, 1882. "If anything happens to me," Silas Vane ordered it. Simple sentence, nothing dramatic. Funny how the plainest words often carried the most weight. Outside, evening wind rattled the dry porch boards. Caleb looked back toward Pike. "You killed Thomas." Pike laughed through swollen lips. "You think anybody cares about one dead miner?" That answer told Caleb plenty, not everything, but enough. Clara folded her arms tightly across herself. "Thomas tried taking this notebook to Santa Fe. Her voice cracked a little there. "He never made it." Nobody spoke for a moment after that. Then Miguel remembered something. His face changed fast. "Ben?" Clara looked up immediately. Young Ben Harker worked near the mine stables. 16 years old, too skinny for his age, always smelled like horses and coal smoke. Thomas trusted the boy because Ben saw things and kept quiet. Too quiet sometimes. Miguel rubbed the back of his neck nervously. "He came by my shop yesterday, said he wanted to leave town." Miguel rubbed his jaw nervously. "Said he'd been hiding down near the old coal pits for 2 days already." Caleb stood slowly. "Why?" Miguel swallowed hard. "Because he saw them drag Thomas into the mine the night before the collapse." That changed everything. A notebook could disappear. Papers could burn. But a living witness scared powerful men more than bullets did. Claire understood it too. That fear returned to her eyes for just a second. "If Silas knows Ben talked..." She never finished the sentence. She did not need to. Everybody in that room already understood. Pike suddenly chuckled from the chair. That ugly sound turned every head toward him. "You folks are already too late." Miguel walked toward him fast. "What does that mean?" Pike leaned back slowly, despite the rope cutting his wrists. Then he smiled straight at Caleb. "Means Silas already sent riders toward Cirillo's an hour ago." The room went dead quiet. Caleb felt that old, cold feeling settle into his chest again. The same feeling he used to get right before funerals. Outside, the last sunlight faded across Galisteo Basin, and somewhere out near the mines, a frightened 16-year-old boy was running out of places to hide. Caleb grabbed his hat off the table. Because if they failed to reach Ben before Silas did, this whole story was going to end with another body buried beneath New Mexico dirt. They left Galisteo Basin less than 10 minutes later. No big speeches, no complicated plan, just four tired people riding into the dark because a scared boy was somewhere out near Cirillo's and bad men were already hunting him. Caleb rode in front. Miguel stayed close behind with a lantern tied low beside his saddle. Clara rode quieter than both of them. She had changed into a darker dress before leaving the house. Her hand still trembled a little while tightening the saddle straps. Probably because white cloth out on open land at night was about as smart as hanging a target over your heart. Funny thing was, Caleb noticed that little detail right away. Men who survived dangerous places usually notice practical things first. The moon sat low over the hills as they followed the dry trail toward the mines. Nobody talked much. Horses breathing, leather creaking, wind brushing through dead grass. That was about it. After a while, Miguel finally muttered something. You ever notice trouble always starts after sundown? Caleb almost smiled. That's because decent folks go home before dark. Even Clara let out the faintest little laugh at that. First one Caleb had heard from her all night. Strange how one small laugh could make a hard situation feel human again. About an hour later, they reached the old stable road outside Cirillo's. That was where Ben liked hiding whenever mine workers got drunk or deputies started asking questions. Miguel raised a hand suddenly. Hold up. Everybody stopped. A horse stood tied near the trees ahead. No rider. Just one horse shifting nervously in the dark. Caleb climbed down slowly and checked the saddle. Fresh sweat, fresh dust. Somebody arrived recently. Then they heard it. A weak whistle from inside the abandoned stable. Clara moved first. Ben. A skinny boy stepped carefully from the shadows, holding an old revolver too big for his hand. Poor kid looked half-starved. Coal dust still covered his shirt. The moment he saw Clara, his eyes watered up from pure relief. They found me, he whispered. Caleb looked around immediately. Who? Ben swallowed hard. Pike's men. The boy pointed toward the hills. Saw two riders near the creek before sunset. Caleb cursed quietly under his breath. That meant Silas was moving faster than expected. Ben kept talking now that fear finally cracked open inside him. He told them Thomas Whitcomb never died in a cave in Pike and two mine guards dragged Thomas into Tunnel 3. The night before the collapse, Thomas kept yelling that Silas was stealing silver from the government and cheating the miners too. Ben heard all of it while hiding near the stable wall. Then came the part that changed the whole room. Ben looked directly at Caleb. They buried him alive. Nobody spoke. Even the wind outside seemed to disappear for a second. Clara slowly lowered her head, not crying. Some pain sat too deep for tears. Caleb felt his jaw tighten hard enough to ache. He had seen ugly deaths before. Gunfights, hangings, men freezing drunk beside campfires. But getting buried alive inside a mine was the kind of thing that stayed with a man forever. Miguel suddenly walked to the stable entrance. They're here. Hoofbeats echoed faintly through the hills. 3 riders, maybe 4. Coming fast. Caleb moved immediately. No panic, no shouting. That old deputy part of him finally woke back up. He handed Clara his extra ammunition. Tie the lantern low and stay behind the feed barrels. Then he looked at Ben. If shooting starts, you run south. Don't stop for anybody. The boy nodded fast. Outside, the riders were getting closer now. Pike's voice drifted through the dark. I know you're in there, boy. Caleb stepped beside the stable door and checked the rounds in his Colt. Slow. Calm. Like a man settling an old debt. Then Clara quietly reached out and grabbed his sleeve for half a second. Not romantic, not dramatic. Just human. She looked at him and asked one simple question. You really think we can beat men like Silas Vane? Caleb stared out into the darkness where the riders approached. Then he answered with the most honest thing he'd said in years. No. He paused briefly. But sometimes losing ain't a good enough reason to quit. And 1 second later, the first shotgun blast tore through the stable wall. The shotgun blast ripped through the stable wall hard enough to shower everybody with splinters. Ben dropped flat to the dirt. Miguel cursed and fired blindly through a crack between the boards outside. Horses screamed and kicked against the dry ground. Caleb stayed calm. That was the strange thing about dangerous men who lived long enough to grow old. The shooting no longer sped them up. It slowed them down. Another blast tore through the wood higher this time. Too high. Pike was firing fast and angry. Caleb already knew what that meant. Orrin Pike wanted fear more than accuracy. Caleb crouched near the stable door and waited, not moving, not rushing, just listening. Hoofbeats shifted outside. One rider moved left. Another circled wide near the creek bed. Old habits came back quick. Caleb could almost picture the whole fight before it happened. Then somebody outside yelled, "Bring the boy out and nobody else gets hurt." Miguel snorted. That promise ain't worth a warm beer. Even Clara looked annoyed hearing that. Funny thing about fear. After enough of it, people sometimes got tired instead of scared. Ben crawled beside Caleb, breathing hard. "I didn't mean for any of this." Caleb kept watching the doorway. "Son, trouble don't care what we mean." Another rider moved near the back wall. Caleb caught the shadow first. Tete. He fired once through the boards. A man cried out outside and hit the dirt hard. Everything exploded after that. Gunfire cracked from both sides. Horses panicked. Dust filled the stable thick enough to choke on. Miguel fired from behind a feed barrel while muttering angry Spanish under his breath. Clara stayed low near Ben, loading spare rounds into Caleb's belt without wasting movement. She was scared. Anybody with sense would have been. But she kept her hand steady anyway. That impressed Caleb more than fancy shooting ever could. Then Pike shouted from outside, "Rusk!" Caleb froze for half a second, hearing his name again. Not many people out west still knew it. Pike laughed somewhere in the dark. "Silas told me about Kansas." Miguel glanced over immediately. Clara did too. Caleb hated that feeling. That old ugly past dragging itself back into daylight. Pike kept talking while circling outside. "Said you wore a badge once?" Another shotgun blast slammed into the stable doors. "Said an innocent man got hanged because of you." Silence hit harder than the gunfire after that. Ben looked confused. Miguel looked uncomfortable, but Clara just watched Caleb quietly. Pike knew exactly what he was doing now. Some men shot bullets. Other men shot shame. Truth was, Caleb had spent years trying to outrun that hanging in Abilene. A ranch hand named Daniel Mercer died with a rope around his neck because Caleb trusted the wrong witness. The real killer escaped south 2 weeks later. By then it was too late. Caleb threw away his badge the same night. And ever since then, every lonely road felt easier than staying anywhere long enough to remember. Pike laughed again outside. "You ain't no hero, old man," Caleb finally answered. "No." His voice stayed flat and tired. "I'm not." Then he kicked the stable doors open and stepped outside, shooting fast, clean. One rider lost his grip and tumbled hard off the saddle into the dirt. Another fired wildly and missed by 6 feet. Caleb moved toward the water trough while bullets punched dirt around his boot. Pike stood near the trees reloading his shotgun. Big mistake. Shotguns were nasty up close. Too slow far away. Caleb fired once. Pike's shotgun spun from his hands into the dust. The deputy grabbed his bleeding arm and stumbled backward, cursing. Then Clara suddenly shouted from inside the stable, "Caleb!" He turned instantly. Ben stood near the back wall, staring into the darkness beyond the stable. His face had gone completely pale. "There," the boy whispered. Far up on the ridge above Cirillo sat 3 more riders watching everything. One of them wore a black vest even in the moonlight. Silas Vane. He never planned on saving Pike. He only came to make sure Caleb Rusk was exactly the man he hoped he was. Tired, guilty, and finally foolish enough to die for somebody else again. Silas Vane stayed up on that ridge for less than a minute. Then he turned his horse and disappeared into the darkness with the rest of his riders. He never came down to fight beside Pike. Men like Silas rarely did. They built their power by making other people bleed for them. Pike stumbled into the dirt, clutching his wounded arm, while Caleb walked toward him slowly through the moonlight. The deputy looked scared now. Not angry, not tough, just scared. Funny how pain stripped the pride out of bad men so fast. Miguel tied Pike's hands tight while Ben sat beside the stable wall, shaking like a leaf in winter. Clara walked over quietly and placed her hand on the boy's shoulder. No speeches, no dramatic promises. Sometimes human kindness worked best when it stayed simple. The ride back toward Galisteo Basin felt different after that. Nobody talked much. The danger was still there. Silas Vane still had money, riders, and friends inside Santa Fe. But something had changed. Before sunrise the next morning, Pike finally started talking. Turns out Pike feared prison a whole lot more than he feared Silas Vane. Men like him usually did once the pain settled in and their boss disappeared. By noon, territorial deputies rode out toward the mining office near Cirillo's. They found hidden ledgers, silver packed inside coal crates, and enough proof to drag Silas Vane out of New Mexico territory in chains 3 days later. Funny thing was, Caleb never stayed long enough to watch it happen. He was sitting on Clara Whitcomb's porch instead, holding a cup of coffee that had gone cold while listening to morning wind move through the grass. And for the first time in years, Caleb looked like a man no longer searching for another place to disappear. For the first time in a long while, Caleb Rusk stopped riding away from trouble. And truthfully, I think that's the part of this story that stays with a man after the gun smoke fades. Most folks think courage means never being afraid. That ain't true, especially not for older men. Real courage usually shows up after disappointment, after regret, after life already knocked you flat more times than you can count. Caleb was not young, he was not clean-handed, and he sure wasn't perfect. But somewhere between that lonely farmhouse and that broken stable outside Cirillo, he finally remembered something many men forget after enough bad years. A mistake from the past does not have to become your entire future. I think a lot of men listening tonight understand that feeling better than they admit. Maybe you said something years ago you still regret. Maybe you trusted the wrong person. Maybe you worked too much and lost time with people you loved. Maybe life simply turned out harder than you expected back when your knees did not hurt and your hair still had color in it. That happens. Life humbles everybody eventually. But stories like this remind us of something important. A tired man can still choose to do one decent thing before the sun goes down. And sometimes one decent thing changes more lives than we realize. Clara Whitcomb probably would have lost everything if Caleb kept riding that first afternoon. Ben Harker might have ended up buried somewhere in the desert beside a forgotten mine. Miguel would have gone back to his blacksmith shop pretending not to notice evil walking through town every day. And Caleb himself would have stayed exactly what Silas believed he was, a guilty old drifter too ashamed to stand for anything anymore. But that is the strange beauty of human beings. Even broken people still get chances to choose differently. That matters, especially these days. But decent men and women still matter, even older ones, maybe especially older ones. Because experience teaches things pride never can. Now, before we close this story out tonight, let me say something honest to you. This entire story was gathered, rewritten, and adapted with a few added details to bring more emotional depth, educational value, and entertainment to the telling. The visual images used throughout this video were created with AI support to help bring feeling and atmosphere to the story. And truthfully, if this kind of story is not for you, that's perfectly all right. Go get some rest tonight. Drink some water. Take care of your health. These old bones we carry around start needing maintenance after enough birthdays. But if this story stayed with you even a little, then leave me a comment down below. Tell me what part hit you the hardest. I read far more comments than you might think, and I gather these old frontier stories because people still need them. Not just for entertainment, but because sometimes an old Western reminds us how to stand back up when life gets ugly.
And if you enjoyed riding through New Mexico territory with me tonight, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel.
There are plenty more dusty trails ahead of us, more lawmen, more outlaws, more lonely towns full of hard lessons and good people trying their best. And before you leave tonight, I want to ask you one last thing. If a man spent years believing he was beyond redemption, but still chose to protect strangers when it mattered most, Do you think that one choice could finally bring him peace? Because maybe that question is not really about Caleb Rusk at all. Maybe it's about every one of us growing older, carrying regrets, and still hoping there's enough good left in us to matter before the ride ends.